Hello, I'm Irma Baker. Welcome to our show. We're sponsored by RSVP, the Retired Senior Volunteer Program, which is a part of Mature Services. Our guest today has some fascinating information to share with us about something that happened in Ohio and makes us sound like the Wild West. We'll be back with our guest right after this message from RSVP.
RSVP of Summit County has been making a difference in our community since 1972. RSVP volunteers are increasing the quality of life by participating in programs and organizations that provide important services to the community. RSVP matches personal interests and skills with opportunities to serve. If you're interested in adding more meaning to your life and improving the lives of others, please call 330-253-4597, extension 166.
Welcome back. Our guest today is Jane Ann Terzillo. Jane is a true crime writer here in the Cleveland area, the Northeast Ohio area, and has written a number of books on history here in our part of Ohio. Today, Jane is going to tell us just how much we're like the Wild West. In this case, we even have it over the Wild West because we were the place of the first peacetime train robbery. Jane, it's so great to have you back with us.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to come here to talk about what I think is probably my favorite book.
And that book is Murder and Mayhem.
On Ohio's Rails.
On
right.
Ohio Rails, yes.
Yes.
Well, I was fascinated in reading your book because, of course, you know, we know about train robberies. They happen out west. They happen with cowboys and attacks on those trains in the wild of the West. But your research showed that the very first train robbery in peacetime, meaning after the Civil War,
Right.
was in Ohio. Tell us about it.
Right. It was in North Bend, Ohio, down close to the Ohio River. And what these guys did was they came from they're pretty sure they came from the Kentucky side, and they came across the river in skiffs, and they laid in wait for this train to go by, and they moved the rail just a bit just to derail the Kate Jackson, which was the name of the engine. You know, they very often named the engines back then.
Well, you know, we have a picture of the type of engine that they were derailing.
Yes, yes, and this came from the Cincinnati. There is a train museum down there, and that's where this, I guess it's a painting, came from, a photograph painted came from. But anyhow, so they derailed the Kate Jackson. They boarded the train, and they are not sure how many of them there were. There could have been 15 or 20 of them. 3 of them were, one of them was in uniform, and 3 of them did seem to have military names. Captain, they heard them say captain to one of them. But they don't think they were guerrillas. They don't think they were Confederate guerrillas because they didn't, number one, they would have, when they derailed the train, they would have demolished the train if they were guerrillas. They also only had handguns. They had no rifles. And of course, guerrillas would have had, Confederates would have had rifles. So they boarded the train, and they got on. The one said, rob every damned man, but don't hurt the ladies. And so they went through the train and took everything from everybody except for one soldier who had been hurt during the wreck, and they did leave him some money. One kind of bright woman in the sleeping car, she rolled up her valuables in her hair.
Oh, she was a big hair lady.
She was a big hair, well, they were big hair ladies back then, you know. And so she saved her jewelry and some of her money that way. So they had pulled the train over. They were probably about an hour, and they finally had to, they used gunpowder to get the safe open. They got what was in the safe, and then they took off across the river on their skiffs again. And the Army chased them into Covington, Kentucky, and down into another small town called Verona, Kentucky. They were able to track that they had stolen some horses, but they were never able to find out who they were. Now, I have to say one other thing. Some historians claim that the first peacetime train robbery was in Indiana, and it was in Seymour, Indiana. It was committed by the Reno brothers, and that was kind of a botched train robbery. But it happened in October of 1866. So they're pretty sure that this one was the first train robbery, peacetime train robbery, a month after the Civil War had closed, which was, the Civil War closed in April of 1865, and this train robbery was committed May the 5th of 1865.
So this year is an anniversary year, the 150th anniversary of the first peacetime train robbery right here in Ohio, down along the Ohio River.
Yes.
Well, my gosh, I mean, that's a story that's worth some documentary or something along the way. But we've had our share of train robberies up here in the more northern and northeastern part. One of them was really a gang of quite vicious robberies, the Blinky Morgan gang.
That would be Blinky Morgan, or Charles Blinky Morgan. He and his gang of, I'm not sure how many, maybe 3 or 4, they burglarized a fur store on Superior, it was called Superior Street at the time in 1887. It was on a cold, very cold, early morning, January 29th, 1887. They broke into this fur store and stole $7,000 worth of fur. Now, this is 1887. That's a lot of furs, a lot of money. And apparently, they threw them into a hack. I'm thinking apparently. They threw them into a hack so that they could get them to a boarding house where they were staying, and from the boarding house they put these furs on a man named Thomas Story's wagon. He drove them to Bedford, put them on a Bedford. They put them in a I guess steam trunks, and from the Bedford station on train they went into Pennsylvania and New York. The worst thing about this robbery wasn't the loss of the money or the loss of the furs, but it was that they caught one of these burglars and they had him in Pittsburgh. So a couple of the Cleveland police detectives went over to Pittsburgh to pick this guy up and bring him back on a train in the middle of the night. So they had one police officer whose name was William Hulligan. He was handcuffed to McMunn. They called him Kid McMunn, and then they had Henry Hone was another police detective was with them. So at Alliance, the 3 men got on the train, and they were Blinky Morgan and 2 other men, James Robinson and John Coughlin, probably those 2. And when they got to Ravenna, they simply just hit Hulligan over the head. Hone was shot and he was hit, and they made it away into the woods with their with Kid McMunn. Hulligan died a few days later. Hone lived to capture them, to go up to Michigan and capture Blinky Morgan, Robinson, and Coughlin. Blinky Morgan stood trial for murder. He also murdered a sheriff up in Alpena, Michigan, while they were trying to capture him. He shot.
You know, we're really talking about desperados here.
Oh yes. I mean, Blinky Morgan, I don't think Blinky Morgan had a conscience. They do not know exactly where he came from. They don't know a background of him. They're pretty sure he was born in 1834 in Philadelphia, but he had many, many last names. Some people said that he was a thief from England. Some people said he came from Trumbull County. Some people said he came from out west. He and this kid McMunn had broken out of prisons, at least 2 that we know of. He was definitely a bad guy. He was one of the bad guys, but he hung for his sins.
So he was actually one of the last hangings?
Yes, and his hanging was horrific, and I think probably that's what kind of nudged them into the electric chair, if that's any better. But he didn't die on the first jump or whatever it was, and the doctors held his arms down until he died. So it was pretty
brutal.
Bad. Pretty brutal, yes. Yeah.
There.
Yeah.
And well, I guess a fitting end for
well, it could be,
that kind of a desperado.
Could be, yes.
You really don't know what was going on in there. Well, there's a very sad case that you cover in the book. The kind of thing it's bad enough to have a train robbery. It's bad enough to have the conductors or the messengers or passengers who are murdered in the train robbery. But in this one, the 12-year-old son of the conductor saw his father murdered. Right.
This happened between Lyndale and closer to Berea. Jonathan Arrett was the conductor of this Big 4 freight train, and he often had his son, his 12-year-old son, go with him. And so they were on their way going toward Berea. They were in the caboose with the back brakeman, and all of a sudden these men, and again they're not sure how many, but probably about 3, maybe 4, broke into the caboose. And Jonathan Arrett, of course, he was about 60 years old. He was trying to protect his son, and I think the brakeman got shot, but he just jumped from the train. And Jonathan Arrett was killed. And the poor child, the 12-year-old, kept his father's body in the caboose and locked the doors because he didn't know whether the others, these shooters had gone, on the rest of the train somewhere, whether they had jumped, he had no idea. So he had to wait until the train came to a stop at the next station. Again, he was never able to identify anyone. They did take some hobos or tramps, what they called them back then, off from the train, and they thought perhaps that they had done it, but the boy could not identify them. He said, no, those were not the men that did it.
So they were taking that 12-year-old boy who had seen his father murdered in that train robbery and confronting him with these various possible suspects.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. The brakeman also was a witness and would look at these men, but they couldn't identify him. There was a detective, a railroad detective, and I never was able to find out what his first name was, but his last name was Mellett. And he really just wouldn't let go of this. And there was a camp near DeForest in Trumbull County that I guess it was quite big, where all these tramps and hobos would cook and sleep and everything. And he thought perhaps that whoever had done the murder would be there. So he enlisted a whole bunch of law enforcement to raid this camp. And by the time he got to the camp was empty. And so whoever did it was never caught. a lot of the train robberies were committed by tramps, but these tramps also would get on trains they'd jump the trains just to go to the next place where they could find work. And so they weren't all, they weren't all robbers, but a lot of the robberies were committed by these types of people. The trainmen, what kind of surprised me was the trainmen, the engineers, the conductors, they all carried guns. And now, after reading the book and after me researching it, I understand why they carried the guns, because it was a